All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar. My name is Adam, and I'll be your moderator. Eric Pook and Matt Donato from Cirrus Consulting Group are our speakers tonight, and they'll be discussing how to avoid making $100,000 mistakes due to the dental office lease. If anyone has any questions, as always, please add them to the Q&A section, and we'll get to them at the end. And Henry Schein is not offering CE credit for viewing or attending this presentation live or on demand. Guys, take it away.
Perfect. Mr. Sweet, appreciate you and all your time. And Matthew, thanks for joining us this evening.
Absolutely. Thank you.
So just quickly in the chat, ladies and gentlemen, feel free to throw out whereabouts you're coming from this evening. We've seen an unprecedented amount of buyers, sellers that are now realizing how important the lease is to that eventual sale. So great to see some North Carolina, Florida. Again, feel free to throw in whereabouts you're coming from. In addition to that, we're going to be sharing a few core components. And certainly for those of you in New York, Manhattan, pretty incredible what's been going on there, and especially as it relates to vacancies, rental rates, and some of the availability of spaces has really shifted a lot of the dynamic for buyers and sellers in the market. Columbus, close to my old headquarters in Dayton, Ohio. San Antonio, Greenville, beautiful. Part of your stomping grounds, Matt.
Absolutely.
So just to kick things off, to get a sense of the room, as I see many are joining here, as a quick intro poll. So just to give us a little sense in terms of the stage in the career you're at. Again, are you looking through on the buying side? Are you looking through on the selling side? I know a number of you reached out confidentially looking and sharing information that you had owned your own building. And so we've customized some of the content here for you this evening for it. But a couple of quick poll questions for us. Again, the goals, general knowledge, looking for some specific guidance, or again, needing some help with the lease. Number two, describing the current situation. So are you planning to start, buy, or build a practice? By the way, we're seeing a lot of renovos now. A lot of doctors contemplating buying a secondary location and relocating it to a new location under their image and design language, which is, again, a pretty popular trend we're seeing just for the past few months. Second piece, again, thinking about that Rockefeller approach to expand, renovate, or relocate the practice, again, depending on how much the landlord's willing to retain you. Number three, which I think will be a big component for us tonight, Adam, is the planning to transition or thinking of selling the practice within the next 5 years. And heck, even if it's 10, a lot of tonight's content will be incredibly important because a lot of the practice transition brokers will really focus on the fact that you should have a transition plan baked in at least 10 years prior to your eventual sale. And that's mainly because of the office lease. If you own your own building, you can state as such. And again, for those of you with a lease that's expiring or heaven forbid month to month, I can't stress enough, the impact to the value of your practice can be exponential if there isn't that predictability and continuity of revenue, which ultimately is what you're looking to sell. And for a buyer, if you're evaluating a practice with a month-to-month lease, right, that can also be pretty scary because the bank, as you may or may not know already, will not issue a loan if there's not sufficient term in the lease. They've been burned enough times that they certainly don't want to be creating a whole new loan and give you $1 million loan to buy a practice, and suddenly 3 weeks later, or 3 months later, or 3 years later, you're out looking for another $300,000 to build at a practice at $250 per square foot down the road. So if you haven't had, and if you've got some specific concerns, there's also, again, an appreciation of time. There's a 15-minute complimentary consult that we can schedule here. All right, so the great state of Texas. Let's jump in. On that note, speaking of the great state of Texas, Matthew Donato is one of our senior consultants who looks over the state of Texas as well as elements of the South. And I've invited Matthew this evening for a few reasons. One is to really help share where the two separate hats in terms of the buying side and the selling side, and covering a lot of the top questions that we're getting on both. The two of us alone have had the privilege of speaking to well over 1,000 doctors since the pandemic has occurred, and therefore we're here to share all those best practices. And again, not to make everybody a leasing expert, but to be able to make sure that we can have a different appreciation for the lease as well as some great practical tips and tricks to help put a protective force field, and as mentioned, help to avoid making some $100,000 mistakes. And unfortunately for a doctor who recently reached out to us, $160,000 mistake. So let's jump in. So a couple of core components is you may or may not be aware that there are three numbers that can make or break your practice and your practice sale: 85, 54, and 80. Some of you may be aware that 85% of you on the webinar this evening, of the hundreds and hundreds of registrants here this evening, right? 85% of you have a lease that can prevent you from ever being able to sell your practice. Some of you may be surprised, but not too surprised to know that 54% of you on the webinar and throughout North America are overpaying in rent for the practice. And this becomes important for a few reasons when looking at your tenancy expense as it relates to income, or if you're dramatically overpaying in rent, that can dramatically impact your EBITDA, your profit, and ultimately the saleability as well. And lastly, some of you may be shocked to know that 80% of landlords structure their lease to give them the right to at least do 50% of the proceeds when the practice is sold. So now that I have your attention, let's jump in. So the purpose, process, and payoff this evening. So the purpose really is to help ensure that you are now empowered and proactively prepared for your acquisition, sale, renewal, expansion, etc., and leveraging some now post-COVID tips about the process and where we're seeing the trends and what we're seeing working with negotiations with landlords across the country. Also, the buying sign, what to look out for. So for the buyers that are on the line, think about what are the core components on your must-have list when evaluating a lease? What are some of your concerns, nice to haves, right? And what are things that you're willing to concede on when looking at the lease from a valuation due diligence perspective? Number three, for the sellers, how do we help to maximize the practice sale proceeds, which means how do we help to make sure that there's a smooth transition of the lease? Many of you that have not bought or sold a practice may be surprised to know that one of the main conditions of sale is either A, the financing of the buyer, typical, right? No different than residential. And number two is the successful assignment of the lease, meaning that the landlord has to physically approve and sign off on the assignment in order to facilitate the sale. And that's in the assignment section for those of you following along within your lease. And also we'll touch on the potential risks as a bottom line to make sure that by the end, you've got some great practical examples and you can see it specifically within your lease today. On that note, who are we? Right? And why are we here to share some of these components? Well, we're unique. We're the only healthcare specialized tenant representation firm of our kind that exclusively focuses on dentists. That's all we do. That's what we've done now for 27 years and successfully and humbly over 12,000 times. So whenever something goes wrong as it pertains to the lease, the Schein team and others will pick up the phone and call us first. What does that mean for you? We've now been able to create a consolidated intellectual property and capital, the language that we see from the largest multinational landlords to the smallest mom and pops, and to help to have built an incredibly strong foundation of leases that allows us the language to really protect and benefit from the 12,000 other doctors and other tenants that have leveraged their services in the past. What makes us unique is we have multiple commercial real estate attorneys on staff. We have some of our negotiators that have been with us for 19 years. Some have negotiated over 1,500 dental office leases themselves. Incredible experience. And also, we have some that used to work for the national landlords. So those that used to negotiate against the dentists, we've now hired on board to now help represent the dentist. So it doesn't feel like it's such a lopsided teeter-totter. The whole objective here is to make sure that as we just finish International Women's Day, a lot of components are how do we help to equate the power between yourself and the landlord. we're privileged to do, we just did the Yankee with Henry Schein, doing some CE credits on the floor. But how do we help to do this? Well, first and foremost, it's the data. And one of the core components we've done and invested in heavily is not only through our existing clients, but also through the fact that we have access to over 95 billion square feet of tracked commercial real estate data throughout North America, which really helps to ensure that as you're entering into the next negotiation, you're sure about vacancies, rental rates, comparatives, and demographics. And we put a little note in the bottom, but if you've ever been questioning about what your market rents are, what demographics are in your area, we have all of that access. And again, in appreciation for the time, you can send us a quick email. Bottom left-hand corner is info@cirrusconsultinggroup.com, and our real estate analytics team will help drive some of those reports for you. Now, as mentioned, I send each of you a quick email to check in prior to the webinar, and we had some great questions. So I wanted to jump in and share a few of these. So Matthew, as we start to jump in and share, what are we seeing now in terms of market changes over the past 20, right now almost 24 months since the pandemic's begun? What have you noticed in terms of buyers, sellers, and the foundation of the lease through the process?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, the biggest change that we've seen the past 20, 24 months now is that it's really shifted quite massively from what used to be this ultra landlord heavy, very landlord friendly market into this now, I don't want to use the word desperation, but with landlords having these vacancies that still have not been filled, and some of those tenants that just couldn't cut it throughout the pandemic, with all of those vacancies continuing to raise even now, it's become an incredible opportunity for many of yourselves and your colleagues that are with us this evening to really get in and take advantage of that vacancy and of that space. And better yet, with that, having a long-standing tenancy in that location for the past 15, 20, 25 years, always paying your rent on time, never being in default, landlords are jumping through hoops to ensure that they can keep you long-term as well. But the biggest change over the past 20, 24 months has really been the shift in the control of the market, essentially.
Yeah, I think that can be summed up just to add is leverage. The dentist now, in my opinion, has a lot more leverage than it had pre-COVID because highest build-out costs, some in the Bay Area of California are paying $400 per square foot for build-out costs, lowest default rate at 0.5%. And by and large, we're one of the few that were open for the most part through pandemic and have been COVID-proof, meaning that none of you have been able to work from home. So many landlords are taking one of two paths. They're taking the high road or the low road, depending on your perspective. Some landlords are saying, boy, I really got brutalized through COVID with being retail heavy and defaults and losing tenants and having the months on market, et cetera, and are now saying, I need to squeeze my tenants as much as possible to make up for that. And unfortunately, they'll look across their tenant mix, look at the dentist and say, well, hey, there's some of the biggest opportunity costs. How much of a rent rate increase can I get away with? Number one. Or number two is to say, you know what, I really want to increase my medical, dental, vet, and ancillary types of services because they are rock solid tenants. And therefore, I'm going to do as much as I can to attract and retain those type of tenants. So that's a major component. One word of caution lately that we are seeing is that because of the Fed, because of risk of inflation, because of CPI, the Consumer Price Index, we're certainly now seeing some landlords getting a little more bullish to say, well, I want a 5% rental rate increase. I want a 7% rental rate increase on an annual basis, not knowing what inflation may become. So as if you are approaching your next renewal, one of the core components that we share is typically 2 years prior to expiry is the best time to engage the landlord. Now, in some cases, it could be even 2.5 years out, especially if you have no further legal right to stay in your space after your lease expires. Meaning, if you don't have any further options or if you've exercised your last option, the earlier you start, right, the more continuity and predictability you have, the better it is for the buyer, the better it is for you as a seller. Again, for those, feel free to use notes. And as Adam briefly mentioned at the beginning, the Q&A section is open. We're happy to cover questions, keep it interactive, and have some fun here this evening. Another key question that came in from a few of you previously were strategies for success. So both for buyers and for sellers. Now we're going to be digging into this a little more, but just to start with some of those Q&A, Matt, what are some of the guidance you're giving to buyers now that are starting to flip you a lease to say, hey, I'm looking at a new practice to buy on the corner of Smith and Main? What are some of the core components you're looking at or guidance you're giving to maximize the benefit for a buyer?
Yeah, I think the first and foremost for that is, I know that we're always all very excited to get into the space and start the practice ASAP. But when you're actually getting into that position, it's crucial that you're doing the proper due diligence, right? And number one, of course, looking at the purchase and sale agreements and beyond, but also taking a deep dive into the lease. What are these obligations or liabilities that you're going to be inheriting, typically for the next 20, 25, 30 years, right? So, not only do we want to ensure that we're doing the proper due diligence, but how to get to the best possible outcome for the negotiation starts with another couple of aspects that we will go through in further detail here as well. But one of the main points is term, right? Just as we had mentioned earlier, some of these landlords with the vacancies on the rise and saying, hey, we want to improve this tenant mix. The longer term that you're willing to provide for that landlord, even to tack on to that term that you may be acquiring with the practice, is key for a lot of these landlords to go, okay, how can we make this happen? How can we get to that next step where you're that new long-standing tenant here in my building?
I think just to add on the buyer side is be careful about taking over the sins from the seller's lease, meaning that if the seller has never had the lease professionally structured or professionally negotiated, and it goes back to 1988, that is the governing document. If that says the landlord can increase rent by 30% upon the sale, or even worse, that the landlord can terminate the lease just for asking to sell the practice, right? That is a major issue that could prevent the whole deal from going forward. So really, to the buyers, the devil's in the details, and make sure that as you're going through due diligence and even before an LOI, make sure that you've read through the lease and are understanding what risks there are within it. For sellers, the similar components apply, right? How much control do you have over the space, and how much term, how much predictability is there that the buyer is looking at? Also for sellers, it's all about liability, personal guarantees, and continuing liability even after the sale. So what is your exposure within the lease today? And some of you may be, again, shocked to know that even after you sell, you may still be a guarantor for the buyer, even though you have nothing to do with the practice. So now digging in a little deeper, one of the other key questions here, and again, feel free to jump into the Q&A as well, is frequent mistakes, especially with buying and selling, or even just renewing the lease. Matt, we get this question a lot. What are some of those frequent mistakes that we try to jump from the rooftops to help doctors avoid?
Yeah, absolutely. And just it kind of piggybacks off of what I've just mentioned earlier. Like I said, we're all excited to get that lease signed, especially when we're getting into the space and what have you. But the due diligence, I can't stress that enough, is going through that lease, going through that letter of intent, taking a look at that lease from cover to cover, right? That is of the utmost importance when we're looking at this. And, unfortunately, one of the other components here as well is some of the landlords will just tell you, oh, this is a great deal, or the broker will tell you, this is a great deal, this is a great deal, you need to take this deal. And unfortunately, I've seen a multitude of your colleagues that go, oh, okay, it's a good deal, and then they get into the lease without doing enough background research on it. So what I always recommend to sort of circumvent that main aspect there is really take a step back, look at everything from cover to cover, and don't rush into it. Yes, we want to get things done quickly, but it's better to get it done properly, first and foremost, because otherwise, as Eric had just mentioned, you, as a buyer, you could be inheriting the sins of the previous seller, or many of you on this evening's webinar that are looking at selling your practice. As we said with the first three numbers there, you could be in a situation where you're unable to sell. And a lot of that can be fixed from the get-go or coming into your next renewal and beyond.
Yeah, I just to add on those two is in many cases, the buyer doesn't truly appreciate the importance of what's within that lease and the impact it has to them. And in some cases, then the seller, one of the main issues we see is that they'll tell the landlord, hey, I'm looking to sell in a couple of years. I'm looking to sell next year. And without knowing it, now has just completely upended the negotiation, because of course the leverage goes completely out the window. So if the landlord knows you're already on the way out, or you telegraph that to them by asking for a shorter term, can dramatically impact your negotiation, can dramatically impact the rent, and put yourselves in the landlord's shoes. If you're on your way out, okay, well, right, your value to me as a longstanding tenant has dramatically changed. So those are some big no-nos to be aware of. Okay, let's continue to jump in through here. So from that perspective, just as a question as we run through, some questions here from a multi-site. So 8 dental practices, wearing lots of hats, owner and landlord, want to discuss getting some continuity and standardization of all the leases. So perfect timing, because that's where we want to talk about for those of you that are an owner occupier. If you own your own space, feel free. There should be a little hand raise type of thing. We can get a quick reflection, or you can type in the notes if you do own your own, because we're going to jump into that now. And certainly for a multi-site, a big question now is exit. So for those of you that have one location or have aspirations to have more than one location, don't underestimate how important that is. If a private equity comes in or a larger group comes in to buy you out, and the lease portfolio is in complete disarray, if we can't find some leases, if we've missed some option to renew deadlines, if some are month to month, if in some cases there's a termination right, if there's relocation or demolition, these are major red flags that could cause potentially you to be responsible for, for paying a certain amount or only a certain number of, or only being able to sell 7 of the 8, for example. But let's touch on it from an owner-occupier's perspective. Great segue. So for those of you that raise your hands, I see we've got about 4 or 5 here that have, and I'm assuming many of you also are as well. If you own your own space, meaning you own the unit, you own the building, you own the suite, it's a standalone or otherwise, one of the main components are rent. Are you paying yourself rent today? And if you are, how are you formulating that rent? Many of you may say, well, I pay $3,000 of mortgage, so my practice just pays my mortgage. Okay, so don't let me be the first to tell you, but your accountant should be one of the first to say, be very careful with that. We did a webinar with Bob Gray recently in December, and one of his core guidance as one of the top dental accountants in the country, one of his core guidance are to be careful. If you are under or overinflating your rent, right, that is not aligned with market, and suddenly you are doing that in the eyes of the Uncle Sam that suddenly sees that you are increasing your rent or decreasing your rent, right, to minimize tax, right, which then is a detriment to the IRS, that can certainly be a major red flag. So one of the main components are make sure it's based on fair market rent. And you want to have the data that in the event of an audit, you can pull up and say, look, here's the 6 or 7 comparables, here's other rentals, or here's other dental rents. And that's one of the core components we do with our clients, is to have all of that data to make sure that, yes, this is very verifiable and it's very aligned with current market rates. Number 2, and this is another big component, it's the deep well theory. What happens if something goes wrong? We just had a pretty brutal winter and are still in it. But, slip and falls. Is it your building or is it the practice that's then responsible for salting, sanding, etc.? Right? If something happens, how is there a clear delineation to roles and responsibility? Or, right, is it not separated? Right? Some of you may own the building personally, or maybe your spouse owns the building personally, and maybe you then own the practice personally. That creates a very deep well, if you will, of meaning money that others can go after, especially if it's not under the protective veil of a corporate shell or otherwise. So again, it's important to have those two specifically delineated. Number three, another big component is the value of the practice. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's say you own your own building, you have your practice, but you've sort of been haphazardly paying yourself rent, or maybe not even at all. And suddenly, if you have been, let's say, paying yourself $1,000, but now when you go to sell, suddenly you want $3,000 a month in rent, or vice versa. Suddenly, to the practice brokers are going to start pulling their hair out, because you're going to create doubt in your financials. It's going to say, well, we haven't really been paying ourselves rent, so let's factor this in, but here's what we want moving forward. The financials aren't going to be true, right? Because now you're doing things differently. So one of the main components for those of you that own your own building is structure the lease now and make sure it's based on fair rent, and design it so that you're just going to assign that lease to your buyer in 5 or 10 or 15 years. So much easier to have a rock solid lease in place. And also, heaven forbid, if something were to happen to you and you were to pass away, without that, again, it can be a landlord friendly. You're your own landlord, you're your own boss, you're your own, landlord and tenant. But how do you help to structure it in a way that, again, if you were to pass away or to sell tomorrow, is it structured for that? And what is the state of your estate? Which leads us to number 4, which is the value of the building. And having, let's say you want to keep the practice but sell the building, right? Having that rent roll, having that historical solid lease in place, as well as term and options, is a great component for the future buyer, because that's what they're buying. They're buying that rent roll. They're buying the cap rate. They're buying the money that they're going to receive from buying your building, and having that consistent rental income to pay that mortgage in the future. So those are 4 main components for those of you that own your own space. Again, feel free. I'm sure that's drummed up some questions. Feel free to throw those into the Q&A components. Again, for those of you that are looking to sell your practice, keep your building, a couple of key questions that you want to be aware of that we share with a lot of our clients. Number 1 is, how do you want to bill? You might just be paying yourself a flat rate today because it's easy. $4,500, it goes from one pocket to the other. But now, hang on a second. If I want to sell, well, the roof might have to be done. The parking lot might have to be done. So do I want to, maybe that's a triple net lease. Well, what the heck is a triple net lease, right? Do I want to pass on those costs directly to the tenant? Or do I want it just to be the same flat rate for the future buyer? And therefore it's a gross lease. But hang on a second, right? New York property taxes have been skyrocketing. So maybe it should be a modified gross. So it includes everything with the exception of certain components such as property tax. So if you haven't thought of these are the type of questions you want to ask yourself. The other components that really can stir some emotions is control. So you're a 55-year-old dentist in San Antonio, and you're looking to sell and keep the ownership of your building. Ask yourself, how much control do you want? If the buyer comes in to suddenly say, hey, I want to paint everything fluorescent orange, and suddenly bulldoze the reception area, and I want to change the layout, I want to do this and I want to do that, are you okay with that? Considering you spent all the money originally to have it in there, and suddenly now someone's coming in to turn it upside down. The other question here is again on ownership on relocation. So ask yourself, if you sell to Dr. Smith then says after a couple of years, yeah, this is fine, but I want to relocate the practice and I want to rip everything out. Right? All of those beautiful ADEC cabinets that you bought years ago, not only the chairs, but also all sorts of components that you feel is your property, the tenant thinks is their property, and suddenly years later, right, you've got a headache on your hand. The other components I touched on before, those historical financials, very important. And really, again, the consent language. So what happens when you sell? right? What happens when you sell to Dr. Smith? You might love Dr. Smith. Dr. Smith might be your associate. However, what now happens when Dr. Smith sells to Dr. Brown, right? What would you do at that point if you didn't approve Dr. Brown, if Dr. Brown had a bad reputation? Right? What would you do? So the control as to whom that can be sold to is one of the other considerations in the assignment and subletting section within your lease. Okay, so to dig forward a little further, I see lots of Q&As coming through. Feel free, again, just to throw those into either the notes or the Q&A section, and we'll have a big section for Q&A towards the end. And Adam, we promise we won't keep you late. 3 things that make up the value of a practice. So I ask you, doctors, what are 3 things that makes up the value of a practice? Some of the top advice from some of the top Henry Schein's dental practice transition team will share with you. I was sharing some examples and something very similar to this to one of the top in the country, Mr. Michael Appalucci, with the Henry Schein dental practice transition team. And it's this, right? So 1 is goodwill and patience, your charts. Number 2, right, is the equipment. What's the depreciated value of the equipment? But the one thing that typically gets, that can impact 100% of the saleability of the practice is the lease. The lease can uniquely impact 100% of the practice sale proceeds. And as an example, when Mike and I were at the Greater New York show pre-COVID, we were sharing the examples of numerous buyers and sellers that when looking to sell their practice at the 11th hour, it was the lease, the silly lease, right? That suddenly the seller, for example, tried to sell and assign the lease. The landlord said, no, we want you, Mr. Seller, to remain personally and continually liable post-sale. Of course, the seller says, absolutely not. Well, suddenly all the back and forth and all the frustration, etc., it took weeks and weeks and weeks. What happened to the buyer? The buyer said, what the heck's going wrong? What's wrong with the landlord? You know, is this the way they're treating the seller? I don't want to come in here. If this is how the landlord's going to treat me in the future, I'm out. Right? And again, don't forget, in the psychology of the buyer, they're already nervous. So the best thing you can do is to have that white glove approach, to have a rock solid lease that's negotiated 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years in advance. And that allows the transition to be so smooth, just like my 1-year-old, right? Well, not anymore. Now she's punching me in the face. But you know, now as you want to just sort of coddle them through and moving forward, right, to make sure that that's a smooth transition. Okay, so where and how? So these are 7 key components. So this is a great slide, take a screenshot of or otherwise. But again, for those of you on the buying or on the selling side, this is very, very relevant. Number 1 is the assignment section. So if you have a digital copy of the lease, follow along, look for or search for the assignment and subletting section. This is the section that specifically dictates if and how you can sell your practice and how much control your landlord may have. If it says this lease is not assignable, full stop, we've got a problem. That means that all the term, all the options, everything that you have in there, if it's not assignable, that leaves the buyer to be able to skip over you and the value of your practice and engage in a new lease with the landlord directly. Major red flag. Number 2 is term, and lots of it. And that can be done as a 5-year term with 2 5-year options, but they need to be transferable options. For those of you that have not gone through the process of buying and selling yet, you might be shocked to know that major banks, Bank of America or otherwise, as the major ones will want to make sure that the buyer has at least a sufficient term on the lease. Meaning that if you're about to sell your practice for $2.6 million, yet there's only 3 years left on the lease and the options to renew are only personal to you, right? That doctor will have a major uphill battle and typically will not get the lease approved by the underwriters, the loan approved by the underwriters. Why? Because there's only 3 years of assurance and wanting a 10-year term to pay it back, but really the landlord's only giving you 3 years to stay. So options, term is a great component. Some of you say, well, I'm nervous because I'm thinking of selling in the future. Granted, right? But don't forget, look at it through the eyes of a buyer or a new young associate. How many doctors are even here today? Feel free to raise your hand if you're one of the associates looking to buy, right? How many of you that now you're looking at de novos versus buying a practice, right, are looking at a $250, $300, or for some of you on the West Coast, $400 per square foot to build out a new dental practice, right? So now you have a fully built out, plumbed, equipped even dental practice. Even if you sold that for $1, sold it for $1 just to sell the leaseholds and transfer the lease, right, that's a beautiful starter practice or a beautiful lease that a new associate would, in many cases, jump through hoops to obtain. It's the holy grail to be able to find a location that's already built out as a dental practice. So term is a big component. Some other components is consideration, and we're going to jump through this. I'm going to come back to this one, but this is where you'd be shocked to know where in your lease that the landlord becomes an equal partner into the proceeds when you sell your clinic. The landlord believes that it's not your blood, sweat, and tears that derives the value of your sale, but it's actually their building and their lease. Number 4 is that continuing liability. So for those of you thinking of selling or buying, right, how much are you putting on your line, on the line, right? What pound of flesh are you offering to the landlord, and when does that go away, if ever? And some of you may be, again, shocked to know that that lease from 1988 that's just been renewed 5, 6, 7 times suddenly then can follow you even after you've sold the clinic. Another component that I strongly suggest, especially for the buyers, are a death and disability clause. We had a terrible situation where the spouse of a doctor had reached out to us. The doctor was 43 years of age, had built out a beautiful 6-operatory practice, and 3 weeks prior to the grand opening had passed away due to a massive heart attack. Fully built out practice, no doctor, no patients. Right? I ask each of you, how much is that practice worth? In this case, nothing, less than nothing, quite frankly. Right? There was a loan amount, there was life insurance to try to cover that loan, but it was the landlord that went back to the spouse to say, unfortunately, Mrs. Smith, you're now responsible for the roughly $9,000 a month, increasing at 4% per year for the remaining 9.5 years on the lease. It's a devastating example. And the reason why we get so passionate about this is, had the doctor had professional representation, we would have fought tooth and nail to add in liability language that would have been an early termination rate, a get out of jail free card, if you will, a death and disability clause that would allow the spouse to terminate the lease with as little as 3 or 6 months worth of notice, with dental specific language or hand tremors, lower back pain, carpal tunnel, etc. Right? All of those, you might not specifically be disabled, but you're no longer able to practice wet finger dentistry. Personal guarantees we'll dig in through as well as the core financial terms. And again, for the buyers, another mistake that's getting made is that just, okay, I'll just assign the lease. No, what a great opportunity. If there's only 3 or 4 years left of the lease, as a buyer, what a great opportunity. You don't want to move in the next 3 or 4 years. Quite frankly, you've got a big loan to pay off. So by structuring a 10-year term with 2 5-year options, gives you a fantastic ability to, tabula rasa, hit the button, create a clean slate, to then negotiate with a landlord as a new tenant, right? And to propose a new 10-year term, you're now dangling a check, right? And just do the math. Take the roughly $3,000 or $4,000 a month over 12 months, increasing at 3, 4, 5% per year, and look at it over the next 10, 15, 20 years that you might be in that location, right? Many of you can be looking at well over $2 million of total financial commitment to the landlord. So just think that little 2-page assignment agreement, right? When you're in the lawyer's office, sending off and signing off and buying your first practice or buying your fifth practice, really appreciate that importance. And to the landlord, and especially those of you with multi-sites, right? Look at that opportunity to say, if this is a $2 million check, you're gosh darn right that I want to make sure that I'm getting it properly negotiated and properly structured to be able to help protect you through the process, limit your liability, and to make sure that it's as sellable as possible to think about your exit. Right? One of the top components that they teach you through business and entrepreneurial school is when you get into a business, what's your exit? Okay, so on that component, good news. Tonight, we are going to spend 1 hour each for each of these clauses that are negotiable and can have the impact of hundreds of thousands of dollars tonight. I can hear Mr. Adam Sweet in the background, our moderator, clicking to cancel the webinar here. I'm kidding. Matthew, though, if you could maybe expand on some of these and look at it both from the sellers and the buyer side, and then we're going to jump into some practical examples.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, the biggest one here is, you can see right underneath the assignment there, demolition and relocation clauses. These are two to be keenly aware of. And so looking at it from the seller's perspective first, a demolition clause, as we look at it and we're looking at selling the practice, this can be a huge roadblock, number one, in terms of the sale of the practice. Because going back to Eric's point earlier, when we're looking at any of the financial institutions, and if they need to grant that loan and they need those 10 years to do so, sometimes that demolition clause is whenever the landlord chooses. And now they have the ability to terminate your lease and you're out on your ear, right? So these demolition clauses, not only, number one, to sell, can it become a huge roadblock and potentially circumvent the buyer from even being able to get financing. But looking at it from the buyer's perspective, if you're about to invest a significant amount of money in acquiring a practice, and you have a clause in that lease that tells you that within a certain period of time, the doors could be closed at the landlord's will, how likely are you to make that investment if you know that? Or how much are you actually willing to pay for that? So on both sides, you have to take into consideration, when we're selling, we want to retain full value of that asset that we've put all of our blood, sweat, and tears into over the past 25 years. But something such as that demolition clause can greatly impact that. Right? Sorry, go
So
ahead.
just to add, some brokerages will actually assess a $250 reduction per square foot, $250 per square foot reduction in the practice sale price, and discount it 15% per year. So if you've got a relocation clause or a demolition clause that kicks in 5 years from now, they will assess a $250 per square foot, right? $250,000, and they'll deduct that from the practice sale price. Why? Because the buyer is now absorbing that risk that they might be out on their ear in 5 years from now. And just as a quick note, the vast majority of you, 55%, are planning to transition or sell your practice in the next 5 years. So each of these components are key, and yet equally, you need to start looking at your lease through the eyes of the buyer. Of course, we're inherently selfish, of course, but right, we need to now think, if we're going to sell this practice, right, what's it going to look like through the eyes of the buyer? Another 18% of you are planning to renegotiate your current lease, right? And another 5% are planning to expand, renovate, or relocate. And also about 23% of you are in a lease that's already expired or month to month. So for those, at the end, there'll be a little section and a poll. Please note urgent. It does create significant risk. Matthew specifically had someone reach out that wanted to circumvent the seller and go directly to the landlord because it was a month-to-month lease. That is just turns my stomach. So if you're in a month-to-month lease, stop. And the most important component that every practice broker will advise you is make sure that there is term, and make sure that you've got something to sell, and make sure that no one tries to leapfrog you, go to the landlord to pay 20% more, because how much is your practice worth without the lease, without the keys? So for those 23% of you, very important. For those 18% with a lease that's expiring within the next 1 to 2 years, right? Very important that, again, you want to be very coy with the landlord through the process. You do want to make sure that your lease is structured in a way that, again, can minimize your risk, but also, again, make sure that you have term and options for your buyer, right? For those of you that are in 3 to 5 years, a good opportunity to, again, look to structure and make sure things are ready to go. And again, for the 14% of you that own is important. And for the 18% of you that don't have a lease agreement, you certainly should. Okay, just to share some of the poll results. Matthew, some other components here. We touch on death and disability. Surrender means what happens if you're to leave, right? If I'm advising a buyer and you have a surrender clause, meaning that the landlord has the right to require you on exit, or whoever you assign to, the requirement to return it to pre-dental condition upon exit, right? Whatever it looked like when you moved in 2004, and you built it from scratch, you may be very surprised to know that most landlords put in language that can require you to remove any leaseholds or to return it back to what it looked like pre-dental. Why? Well, think about it. If you were to leave and the landlord couldn't fill it right away and they wanted to demolish it, or the plastic surgeon next door wanted to move into your space, right? What impact would that have? Who do you think would rather pay, the landlord, the 15 grand to demolish it, or the outgoing tenant, right? That's the surrender clause. Some other components here, again, Matthew, from an overholding perspective, what is overholding? And what does that mean to those that are month to month?
Yeah, so overholding, can mean a couple things depending on the lease agreement. But the first thing here, overholding means that your lease is expired. You are now on what is referred to as a month-to-month basis, which what that means is that the landlord has the right at any time within 30 days notice to kick you out of the space, right? That's it. And obviously, as we're looking at selling practices and retaining full value in investments and so on and so forth, and the importance of term in that process, very difficult to have a buyer be able to get that financing if there's no term in place. And beyond that, for yourself, as you're looking to go through that process, what happens if the landlord puts the brown envelope on the door tomorrow morning when you walk into the practice and he goes, okay, well, thank you for your tenancy, been month to month now, we'll be terminating the lease upon 30 days notice. What's your plan at that point in time? What's the first call you're going to make? Because that exposure is substantial, especially moving towards transition and beyond, right? The other component of that holdover period is for any of you that may be going or may have a lease expiry that is extremely close or have already gone into that month-to-month scenario. Say at about 99% of lease agreements that there is a clause within the overholding provision that you are to pay usually anywhere between 150 to 250% of your monthly rental payment as you've gone on to that month-to-month lease.
And even worse, there's no limit. They could go back to the time that you became a month-to-month tenant. So in the essence of time, a few components to follow along with. Number one, again, is the assignment provision. So this is, you should have a digital copy of your lease, right? Let's run through some of these practically. Number one is you cannot sell your practice without the prior written consent of the landlord, number one. Number two, the landlord, by just asking to sell your clinic, number one, the landlord can approve your request. Number two, decline your request. Number three, terminate your lease just for asking to sell the practice. Just to assign the lease, the landlord can terminate the lease, right, and kick you out. Number three, the landlord shall have the right upon sale of the practice to either increase it to fair market value or 15%, whichever is higher. Unbelievable. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is the specific section that refers to something called consideration, which is you want to look for very carefully in your lease. In essence, what it states is that if you sell your practice for $1 million and you pay $100,000 in rent, that $900,000 difference that you are receiving as cash from the seller, right, from the buyer rather, in conjunction with the sale of your practice, the landlord is now saying that that is their value, their money from the sale of your practice. I can hear the yells and screams from here, right? Which is why it's so important to make sure that there's clear language that states that the landlord is not entitled to the sale of your practice, to any of the consideration, money or otherwise. And last but not least, this is a big one that some of you may be surprised to know, but the tenant shall not be released from its obligations under this lease and shall remain liable for any failure of the tenant or its assignees to observe each and every covenant of this lease. In other words, you sell, the buyer comes in, and the landlord looks at you just as not only for the rent, but also for the full performance of the lease, damages or otherwise. You can be on the hook for that, right? So it's no different than co-signing a lease for your neighbor's teenager and then moving out of state and hoping for the best. Right, so that continuing liability clause is a major component to certainly be aware of. So again, one clause, the assignment clause, as you can imagine, right, can be impacting, and quite frankly, can impact hundreds of thousands of dollars, not just 100, but anywhere from $250,000 to over $750,000 of liability. A practical example and a case study recently from one of our 5-star Google reviews was a doctor who tried to sell her practice 3 separate times. And at 74 years of age, the landlord wanted her space and wanted her out. Right? She hired us. We had to find her a new space, relocate her practice about 10 minutes north. And luckily, we were able to negotiate and get the new landlord to cover 100% of the build-out costs. Right? But can you imagine being at the end of your career, having tried to sell the clinic 3 separate times, and each time the landlord said, no. And suddenly now, you, at that late stage in your career, physically have to go through the frustrations of relocating, right, just to sell your practice, all because of, right, 5 lines on a sheet of paper. Number 2, as we wrap, is the option to renew. So this is important, as we talked about, for term and predictability. So what is one of the first things you notice here on the lease? In the very first sentence, it states here, provided that Dr. Joe Black shall remain as tenant, right? Meaning that this is only good for Dr. Joe Black. And if Dr. Joe Black sells it to Dr. Joe Green, right, Dr. Green is out of luck. Number 2, if the tenant rather, is not in default, and there are just devastating examples where the landlord would use something as silly as a photo of the door of the doctor that shows the hours of operation as a reason to terminate the lease or to hold the dentist in default, not tell them up until the point that she's tried to renew the lease in preparation for sale. This is also another red flag, is that if you are to renew the lease, it's on the then current term, meaning everything you've negotiated for it goes out the window. The landlord can put whatever they want in front of you at that time. Right? And another red flag is that you're on the world's most boring roller coaster that Matt always likes to share. That, again, in no event when you renew your lease will the rent be less. Well, heck, we just said COVID. Why? Why would you be stuck up here without any ability to renegotiate to market rents? Right? And last but not least, this can be interesting. Let's say others in the building did not do a good job negotiating or did not get any help. Suddenly now, if everyone's water is rising, everyone's losing because they're paying now well above market rents. Again, one clause, the cost of this alone can be hundreds of thousands if it forces a relocation or if it prevents a sale. One example in the great state of Texas is this. Right? This is a doctor who had a friend as a landlord until he got this letter. What it stated here is that, as you know, your lease expires on November 14th, 2018, pursuant to Section 2.4 of your lease. You had an option to renew the lease for 5 years at market rate. However, you're required to give me written notice of your intention to renew by not later than 6 months prior to the expiration of your current term. By my calculation, that was no later than May 14th, 2018, which you did not do. Please be advised that my broker will be placing a for lease sign. And this doctor had only been in the location for 5 years, just built out a beautiful practice, right? And suddenly 6 months prior to the end of that first 5-year term, got this letter. And at the bottom, right? Oh, of course, if you do want to stay, have your people call my people. So to summarize, Matthew, what are the core takeaways to look at it from the buyer's perspective?
Yeah, so, right, like I said earlier, going back, full due diligence, right? That is the key piece. But some of the main factors to look out for, as Eric mentioned, some of that surrender language. What are you inheriting in this lease agreement? Are you now having the obligation to rip everything out all the way down to the studs? Are you going to be responsible for any costs if there is to be a relocation of the space by the landlord? Is there a clause in there that gives the landlord a termination right to kick you out and redevelop the space, right?
And similarly on the seller side, right? All these applicabilities for the buyer are exactly the same for you. But mostly as you go to sell, it's the liability, continuing liability, and the ability to put that protective force field around your practice sale proceeds. Right. First of all, again, in appreciation, we will provide a copy of our ebook. So if you send us an email to info@Cirrus Consulting Group, right, we'll send you a copy of your guide to a smooth practice transition and give you some specific references and QR codes you can utilize for that. In addition to that, again, if you think of retiring or selling in the next 10 years, we have a separate component and knowledge guide to really go through specific examples, specific practices, and to how to prepare yourself. Bottom line, though, don't let the landlords win. Don't fall into the trap of, missing. The best time to start the renegotiation process is 24 months in advance. Right? Landlords are great about deferring, stalling, delaying. Suddenly you're 12 months, suddenly you're 8 months. And before you know it, you've received a letter, you're into the red because you've missed that option to renew deadline. So the takeaways on how we win, and then we'll go to share and go to some Q&A. But the first thing to win is this. Number one, get all the information. If you don't have a digital copy of the lease, you should, in part of PPP or otherwise, email your landlord tonight, tomorrow. Please send me a digital copy of my lease that should be signed by you and the landlord. Number two, right? Really think about your long-term goals and what that means to you. Number three is have someone look at the lease, if nothing else, to highlight some of the red flags so you know going in. Number four, know what market rate is. Are you paying 30% more? Or for a doctor we did in Vista, California, we got her a 30% reduction in rent just for renegotiating because she was on the world's most boring roller coaster. And number five is before you pick up the phone and call the landlord, please don't, right? Go through 1 through 5 and determine that carefully choreographed game of chess first before sharing anything about your selling plans or trying to renegotiate financials or any of the business clauses. And again, don't stop until you get a lease signed by both yourself and the landlord. Hundreds of 5-star Google reviews, many of which through the assignment and sale of the practice, which is a core component. And last but not least, as we wrap here, in appreciation for everyone's time, we pass on a $2,000 value, which is 3 to 4 hours of our team's time to analyze your lease for traps, red flags, schedule a Zoom call, going through section by section, and also pulling all those real estate and demographic reports to ensure that as you're planning to, for the 55% of you planning to sell, go into it with your eyes wide open, right? Make sure that as you're working with Mike Capellucci or any top practice broker out there, right, that you're getting the best guidance to help maximize your practice sale proceeds and to ensure that you have a smooth transition. Now, it's never too late to structure the lease properly, but the earlier it is, the better, and the less it is for the landlord to pull the rug out from under you. So we'll pull up a quick poll that allows you the opportunity just to click for the roughly 23% of you that are in a month-to-month lease. Please click urgent, because that is one of the riskiest propositions. That, heaven forbid, if something were to happen to you on the drive to the office tomorrow morning, and that lease was month to month, the value of your practice diminishes overnight and minute by minute that it's vacant. And suddenly, what's stopping a buyer going directly to your landlord, structuring a new lease? And now suddenly your estate is now what? Selling the depreciated equipment and chairs and your charts. So suddenly all of that hard work that you've done, no different than the wills and estate planning that you've done, suddenly now goes out the window because, right, you unexpectedly passed away and suddenly now left a mess for the estate that could dramatically impact the saleability of your practice. So from that perspective, again, note if it's urgent, right? If you are a tenant with a lease, right? And again, can't stress enough, schedule that lease review, right, and analysis so we can help to get a better understanding for your situation. I'm happy to speak to each and every one of you personally. As you can see, morning, noon, and night, still at the office. Happy to support our clients and make sure that all of the hard work, especially through COVID, you don't let a penny of that practice sale proceeds fall to the wayside or go into the pockets of the landlord when that is your hard-earned money and your retirement income. So on that note, we'll open it to Q&A. Matthew, any final points to mention?
No, I think you covered everything there, Eric. But yeah, absolutely. Really, to summarize, as we've mentioned a couple times, nothing is more important than due diligence on the buyer side. And on the seller, it's all about ensuring that it's as smooth of a transition as possible. There is nothing worse than getting through into the latter stages of that sale and into that 11th hour of the negotiations and conversations that the rug gets pulled out from underneath you. I mean, Eric and I were both in conversation with a doctor nearly a year ago to the date that the landlord at the 11th hour said, no problem, we'll allow you to sell. But as a result, we want 25% of the proceeds of sale, right? And these things can happen if it's not properly structured through the lease.
And then for those on the multi-site side, this was, again, a terrible example where the doctor was selling multiple of their current locations to a much larger group. And the one landlord in a strip mall said, no, I refuse to assign the lease. We want to redevelop, right? We want to change the mix, and refuse to assign the lease. Well, it cost that doctor a check for $160,000 as an adjustment on close, and that could have caused the whole sale to fall to the wayside. And then, Matt, one of the questions we had a little bit before was, number one was a big question regarding the continuity, standardization of some of the leases. So for those doctors with multiple locations, what are some of the strategies we do with some of our larger enterprise accounts to ensure consistency between, or at least some commonality between the leases in multiple different locations with different landlords or different tenants?
Yeah, so certainly one of the first components when going through that structuring is really getting a key understanding of the business that is being taken place there. Are all of the practices operating the same services? What does the makeup of the practice look like? How many different doctors are in that practice? And to each of those as well, it's important to note maybe one of them is a buy-in opportunity or something like that. But keeping them unilaterally similar is of key importance. And that really boils down to some of the facts, such as annual increases. Do we want to keep those in the same fashion across all? how are we calculating the rental rates? Now, some of these may change in depending on whether or not it's a standalone building versus a multi-tenant building, because that can change some of the makeup. But then, of course, for yourselves is ensuring, if we're structuring the lease from the start today, giving them all the same expirations, notice periods, so on and so forth, because then you have the ability to know exactly when those will be up. And that can help you with a much smoother transition as well, should you want to continue to retain ownership of buildings and sell the practices singularly or all at once as well.
Yeah, just to add, trying to keep things, a lot of the standard clauses the same, make things a lot easier. Your eventual exit, let it be private equity or otherwise, your ability to surrender, your ability to make changes within the space, the inclusion of water as a process. Whatever those very specific clauses are, especially being the landlord, keeps things, first of all, a lot easier. And more importantly, it creates, again, a template that as you get larger and larger, right, you've got more protections throughout the process. And as issues crop up, having them as similar as possible, right, ensures that when it eventually sells, it's that much more of a selection of assets, right, rather than what could be a massive undertaking with change of control or other clauses throughout the process. Okay. First of all, thank you all for the Dr. S. This was great. Thanks for your time. So thank you for your warm words, etc. For those of you again in the notes that all went to the hosts and panelists, we appreciate those. We'll certainly follow up with that as well. Mr. Sweet, we promised we wouldn't go over time, so appreciate everyone's questions. And back to you, Mr. Sweet.
Excellent. Thank you guys so much. If there are any outstanding questions, feel free to contact Eric and team at the contact info on screen, or you can email webinars@henryschein.com and we'll route your question accordingly. We did record tonight's webinar, so we'll get that out to everyone in the next week or so. And then if you want to attend any future Henry Schein webinars, visit henryscheindental.com/webinars. That's all I got. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you all.